Frank was a senior citizen, a widower who'd lost his wife Estelle nearly 3 years ago. Fixed income, retired, with Social Security and a very small pension. He had a little house which had been in a not too bad neighborhood in the early 70s, but by now it had fallen into what people used to call the wrong side of the railroad tracks. Gangs had moved in, crack had taken over, street hookers were more and more open about their business. Police didn't come by very often, and when they did, it was a pretty cursory visit, in and out, quick. Well, Frank really would have liked to move out and into a better neighborhood, or maybe even down to Florida, because frankly, he didn't like the people who lived on his block anymore. They were noisy, they were careless and unemployed. They were a vastly different skin shade than he was. Everything they did seemed to kind of feed the various stereotypes he'd always carried around anyway. But like it or not, this was going to be his neighborhood until he died because he couldn't afford better. In fact, he didn't even have a car anymore. Unless he pooled with someone, he couldn't even get to a grocery store in an upscale area. So he bought all of his necessities like milk and razor blades at the corner 7-Eleven. And sometimes his guts tightened as he passed by the tough kids who hung out there with their skateboards and their black tank tops and their bandanas and their muttered obscenities. He never said anything to them, but his mind was always racing with the things he'd like to say. It was always a relief to unlock his own front door, undo the second deadbolt, plop his little bag of groceries on the scarred Formica table, and lock things back up tight. And then one day, the thing he'd always feared might happen actually did. Frank was out of bread and cooking oil, and Gary, his once-in-a-while car-loaning friend, was away to take care of his sister. So Frank, taking just the few dollars he knew he'd need, walked slowly to the 7-Eleven again, noticing the new batch of ugly graffiti, most of it unintelligible. "Stupid punks," he uttered to himself. "They write stuff and nobody knows what it means." Then he realized that it was probably better that way, but it still made him boil inside. He was about half a block from the crowded parking lot of the convenience store when a huge black car came by real slow, with the back end jacked up about a foot and a half, with all of its subwoofers blaring out rap music that went right through pedestrians. And then a shot rang out. For just a second, the kids in the parking lot thought the car had backfired. And then they saw Frank, this aging, lonely, angry, beat-up man, crumpled next to the curb, blood oozing from a wound in his shoulder. And everybody just froze. For about 5 seconds, they just stood there. The car was moving away from the store, and they watched as it picked up speed and kept going down the street. No motive, no message, just a random act of violence, a drive-by shooting. That was all it was. And the kids and the customers just stood there. A couple of the teenagers went over about halfway and got a closer look. "Man, he's bleeding bad," one of them said. But they didn't know if it was dangerous to touch him, or if the car might be coming back, or just what to do. So they kind of moved back, walking backwards until they were in the parking lot again. "Anybody call the cops?" a woman asked. "I think the guy in the store will," a 9-year-old boy said. "He usually does." He said it like, "Well, that's his job. This happens all the time around here, lady." On the other side of the street, filling up his tank at the Arcos self-service station, was a preacher. He'd pulled off the freeway because he was down to fumes, and he too heard the one shot ring out. He saw the senior citizen jerk once, then fall down on the pavement. And about 15 seconds later, the gas pump clicked off, and the man of God stood there transfixed. What do I do? He was supposed to meet a wealthy donor at a restaurant within 40 minutes. This was a man who'd hinted he was about ready to contribute $25,000 to the church building program, and he didn't like to be kept waiting. For just a moment, the preacher, out of habit, almost started to cross the street. Then he saw the gang members down at the 7-Eleven. He saw the blood oozing into Frank's gray flannel shirt. He pictured in his mind the mess, the hot tar of the pavement getting on his pants, the blood on his hands, the smell of sweat and the odors of this rough ghetto neighborhood on his clothes. And very slowly, feeling a twinge, but only a twinge, a quick passing twinge of guilt, he put the nozzle back, twisted the gas cap into place, and pulled back onto the freeway. Somebody will call 911, he said to himself. That's not my job. It's their job. And he was less than a mile down the interstate before he'd completely forgotten it. Another man heard the same gunshot and kind of froze up morally too. He was a deacon of a church about 8 blocks away, but he always came over here during his lunch break because there was a funky little used bookstore that sometimes had the great religious classics for $0.25 or 50 cents. In fact, this very afternoon, he'd scored a dog-eared copy of Peace with God, Billy Graham's very first book, an autographed copy for just $2. And as he came out of the bookstore and stepped into the hot sunshine, he heard the muffled little pop and saw Frank collapse. And here again was that moment of wrestling. Is this my problem? I'm just a visitor shopper here, out of my usual suburban cocoon. He watched the teenagers in their own slow motion reaction, some kids moving hesitantly toward the fallen man, others going into the store, others sort of easing away. One boy holding a skateboard was over at the payphone. Was he calling for an ambulance? Well, the deacon couldn't tell. But he glanced at his watch and noticed with a bit of relief that he was late. There was no way he could stop and check. He'd be late getting back to Century 21 where he was the top salesman. And he had escrow papers from 3 big deals sitting there on his desk. One of them was a sale to a Hollywood couple, and he hoped he might even have a chance to say something to them about God the next time that they got together to work on the financing. He as a deacon better get back to that and trust that someone else here, someone who belonged here and knew the ways and the rhythms of this neighborhood, would take care of things. So very quickly, glancing around to see if that ominous black car might be circling back, he punched in the numbers for his new keyless entry leased car and drove away without looking back. And Frank lay there on the pavement. 5 minutes went by. 6, 7. He was still conscious, but feeling weaker by the second. The blood wasn't flowing quickly, but he could tell that it was still seeping through his shirt. It was all over his face, and the little granules of sand and concrete particles were pressing into the scarlet streaks on his cheek. "Somebody help me," he tried to say, but his voice was drowned out by the traffic. "Please, somebody." And then he heard a voice. "Hey man, you okay?" He couldn't turn his head even, but he could barely make out the form of a teenager. One of the kids at the 7-Eleven. Blue jeans, a ratty white shirt with nothing but the picture of a fist on it. The boy had put down his skateboard and was kneeling next to him. "Man, you're hit bad," the boy said, his words softened by his accent. "Those guys nailed you in the shoulder, looks like." "Please, don't hurt me." Frank felt his weakened pulse fluttering for a moment. Would this street punk finish him off? Take the $3 he had in his pocket? Can you call 911 for me?" "I already did, man." The boy took off his bandana and began to gently dab at the blood on Frank's face. "But they're slow at 911, really slow, especially around here. By the time they get to us, you'll die for sure, or at least melt in the sun." And all at once, Frank, this senior citizen with a bullet in his shoulder, found himself in the back seat of a classic Ford Mustang, and this skateboarding boy from the hood and his fellow gang member were driving their human cargo 1.5 miles to the emergency room of the county hospital, helping the orderly get Frank onto a stretcher, waiting for 1 hour and 15 minutes while doctors took a look at him. And, wonder of wonders, when the clerk at ER said that they had to have a signature or a Medicare card or an insurance number or some kind of copay before they could do anything at all, this kid from 7-Eleven dug into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a $20 bill. "That's what I get pouring concrete every weekend," he told the clerk. "Take it. And if you need more, well, I can get it, but probably not till Sunday." "Can't your friend pay?" the nursing clerk asked him, her voice suddenly soft and with a bit of awe, like she was experiencing something right out of the Bible. "My friend?" The kid laughed, his amusement bouncing off the block walls of the unair-conditioned waiting room. "Are you kidding? Man, I never saw that guy before in my life."